The radically dysfunctional American healthcare system programs us to get sick, get on long-term prescriptions, and get some expensive body scans until we're out of money and benefits. Our healthcare system is in shambles after the insurance company capture of independent hospitals and the mismanagement of the COVID pandemic. More and more people are realizing that there is no one coming to save us after a life of processed food, alcohol, stress, and poor sleep. There is no greater wealth than keeping your health or improving your health if you are already at a deficit. The vast majority of people find their way to cannabis medicine after Western medicine has failed them. For the 10 years I've been helping patients, nearly everyone who has approached me for direction in cannabis use has already been spent dry by the healthcare system and given little to show for it. Cannabis medicine is still considered a last resort for most folks. I propose that we start looking more at cannabis as a preventative, a potent source of stability, both physically and emotionally. For true longevity, cannabis can take some time to bear fruits, but the results from early and daily use of cannabis offers rewards that are often described as miraculous by traditional doctors. Pairing daily cannabinoids with whole foods and less alcohol could possibly be today's fountain of youth. If you want to learn about cannabis health, cultivation, and technique efficiently and with good cheer, I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. We'll send you new podcast episodes as they come out, delivered right to your inbox, along with commentary on a couple of the most important news items from the week and videos too. Don't rely on social media to let you know when a new episode is published. Sign up for the updates to make sure you don't miss an episode. Also, we're giving away very cool prizes to folks who are signed up to receive the newsletter. There's nothing else you need to do to win except receive that newsletter, so go to shapingfire.com to sign up for the newsletter this week and be entered into this month's and all future newsletter prize drawings. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and I am your host, Shango Los. My guest today is neuroscientist and cannabinoid researcher Hunter Land, PhD. Hunter Land is the Vice President of Research and Development at Biopharmaceutical Research Company, one of the few DEA Schedule I FDA-compliant cannabinoid research and development companies. He has 20 years of R&D expertise across 25 different indications, as well as 12 years of cannabinoid-focused research. As an expert in the field of cannabinoid science, he has developed a pipeline of discovery work on over 20 novel cannabinoids and terpenes. Previously, Dr. Land acted as the Senior Scientific Director, Director of Cannabinoid Research, and Scientific Spokesperson at Canopy Growth. Most notably, though, he was GW Pharma's first full-time R&D employee in the United States, where he played a critical role in the development of Epidiolex and Sativex and co-authored multiple protocols for the treatment of refractory epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, and pain. Dr. Land has presented at over 50 scientific conferences, is a named inventor on 9 patent applications, and has over 20 publications. Hunter serves as guest lecturer at the University of Wisconsin and the University of Colorado Skaggs School of Pharmacy, and holds other important positions, including Chief Scientific Officer for the National Hockey League alumni, Scientific Board Member of the Veterinary Cannabis Society, and member of the Advisory Board for the Council of Federal Cannabis Regulation. Special thanks to the folks at Medicinal Genomics who shared Hunter's presentation on longevity at CanMed 2023 this year on YouTube. CanMed deserves a lot of credit for making these presentations public and not gatekeeping them. You can find links to Hunter's and all the other CanMed presentations on the Shaping Fire website page for this episode. During the first set today, we will discuss what longevity is in practice, the mechanics of aging at the metabolic level, how increasing cellular energetics improves your health span, and how the endocannabinoid system plays a significant role in all of this. The chunky second set is devoted to discussing individual cannabinoids, their longevity benefits on particular health systems, functional cannabinoid ratios, and how to go about determining an individualized dosing strategy to meet your goals, including a vibrant discussion of using whole plant resin versus cannabinoid isolate. And during the third short set, we will focus specifically on a few cautions to consider when taking cannabinoids to extend your functional life. Welcome to Shaping Fire, Hunter.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, getting right into it, one of the things I like about your presentations is you make this very delicate delineation about lifespan and health span, because so often people just think about how long will I live. But as I get older, I realize that there's a lot of difference in quality of life if I get older and sicker. So will you tease those apart for us so that you kind of set us up for the direction we're headed in today?
Of course. I think it's a critical distinction. Living a really long life, but not a robust life filled of activity is certainly a shortcoming, right? So we don't want to have the situation where we can live, well over 100 years, but our last 30 years, we're unable to do the things, the normal activities of daily living that we enjoy. That goes to quality of life. So a lot of us researchers, we don't just look at how long something could keep you alive. We look at the quality of life there in the middle. And interesting enough, that kind of middle set of health span measures, mainly around activity level, seems to feed quite well into lifespan generally. So those who are maintain health and health span measures in the middle of life often, as an extension of that, extend lifespan quite significantly. And then those who extend lifespan often don't have this prolonged, unfortunate lack of activity at the terminal years of their life.
So that definitely gives us the idea that, in one way, it might be better to live a higher quality, shorter life than a longer life that's lower quality. Because if you're really getting sicker the last 20 years, it's like increasingly being in a prison, and yet you're still alive.
Exactly. I think the goal ultimately would be both, and I think we can achieve both with some level of intervention. And we've seen, an extensive change in lifespan. If you go back maybe 100 to 150 years, average life expectancy was about 35 years. It was riddled with problems around giving birth, infections, lack of surgery. And now we have those things and we've been able to extend life. But unfortunately, the health span remains to be problematic in that kind of those middle years of life, and ultimately impact age-related disease.
So I don't think that we need to convince very many people that living a long and healthy life is the goal. So that's probably going to be our easiest thing to, try to convince people of today. So let's move right on to the part of that the endocannabinoid system can play in this. I'm gonna start with how I normally explain the endocannabinoid system, just because patients dig it. But then I'm gonna ask you to give us like a more elaborate scientific explanation. But to people who have never come across the endocannabinoid system before, I always say that it's very similar to being a second grade teacher in the room. You've got the teacher in the room, and you've got all these students, and when the teacher's in the room, all the kids are pretty much doing what they're supposed to be doing. But then if the teacher gets called out of the room, the kids might be good for a few minutes, but eventually one kid cracks up, and then another kid cracks up, and then like all the kids are cracking up. And then eventually the teacher comes back in the room and has to settle everybody back down. And our endocannabinoid system is in the same way. Like, if the endocannabinoid system gets weakened, eventually one of the systems that it moderates will go bad, and then another one will, and another one. And it may be different systems that are falling out of balance for different people first, but the chaos increases as they run into each other. So, that explanation would certainly never fly at one of your scientific conferences. So I would appreciate it if you would explain in a more scientific way how the endocannabinoid system acts as the body's master regulator for all of these mission critical systems.
Oh, well, I think the analogy is really interesting and suitable. I like to think of it generally, the endocannabinoid system, as the rest, relax, restore system of the body. I think that was something that Ethan Russo, one of my mentors, refers to it as, and I think it's a good representation of how that system works. if you look at the brain, the cannabinoid 1 receptors, these are receptors that THC is an agonist or activates these receptors, as well as your own body's cannabinoids or endogenous cannabinoids. And that's essentially how the system functions, is by either local activation, your own body's endocannabinoid system, or by external cannabinoids. And THC, I think, is one of the best examples of what we would call a partial agonist at CB1. And an easy way to think of this, again, not trying to go in too much detail, but your brain, it has neurotransmitters that signal for effects. And these things can be, certain neurotransmitters may act like stimulants, so think caffeine, and other neurotransmitters may act like benzodiazepines, so think Xanax. And these are signaling pathways, but if you get too much release of the stimulant component, so that's glutamate, or the benzodiazepine, the Xanax-like component, which would be GABA, things can go awry, because we don't want these systems to be out of control, just like your second graders in the classroom. And the second grade teacher, so to speak, would be your endocannabinoid system, which actually tells these neurotransmitters to stop, to settle down, to calm down, so not release as much of this neurotransmitter, essentially like a reset switch for those systems. The interesting component is this happens on a very localized level, so you're not reprimanding the whole classroom. Your body doesn't punish all the kids if only 2 of them are bad. It only focuses on those 2 bad children, or the small section of neurotransmission that's gone awry. The important difference here is when you take an exogenous cannabinoid, so like THC, it can downregulate all of that system. So the stimulation and the inhibitory, or the Xanax-like effect, which can be problematic. If you use too much, then that's where you get massive anxiety and paranoia. So it's a very particular system that can be regulated well on its own, and in many cases may need to be regulated, or people can benefit from regulation using something like THC.
So we're not going to dwell too much on the mechanics, but I do have a couple other questions to go down this path before we switch. Often we will talk about certain cannabinoids being an agonist or an antagonist. And my understanding is an agonist essentially is turning on something, or an antagonist is turning off something. And often, lay people will talk about, this or that cannabinoid turning on or off a receptor, causing a particular effect or another. Is it really like that black and white, 0 and 1? Do these agonists and antagonists really just flip a switch and it's either A or B, or is it more analog where there's a range of how much it is being agonized or antagonized?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a tremendous range, and we could probably do a show on just that component, or just that question, which I think we'll skip some of those details. But the degree to which you stimulate or agonize a receptor or block it can be very powerful, or it can be more gentle, right? So THC is not a very potent agonist. It's not like a sledgehammer for your CB1 receptor. There are some synthetic cannabinoids like spice and K2 that are extremely inebriating and very potent and very dangerous, and can cause a lot of side effects. There's also antagonists, so at lower doses, THCV, so similar to THC but with 2 less carbons on the tail. It can be an antagonist, so it can actually block your endocannabinoids and may lead to a very different effect. There was a drug called rimonabant that was designed to be an antagonist. And unfortunately, it's something we call inverse agonist. So it's not like THC, I think is the important point. And what happened with that particular drug is it caused increased suicidal ideation. So people were depressed. Some people were depressed, and some people had suicidal thoughts. They also lost weight and seemed to help regulate blood sugar and a couple other aspects. So your point of how strong something is at either blocking a receptor or stimulating a receptor, especially as it relates to medicine and health outcomes, is of critical importance.
So circling this mechanics conversation back to this idea of longevity and that bigger holistic picture, when we think about the endocannabinoid system and its ability to turn on and off different systems to bring them into balance, things that are running hot, it can have it settle down, or if something is too sluggish, it can suddenly be stimulated by the endocannabinoid system. Most of us, folks who are cannabis enthusiasts but are not researchers, we throw around the ideas of the CB1 and CB2 receptor, pretty liberally, even if not necessarily scientifically accurate, just so that we can generally understand how to dose ourselves one way or another. And I know that CBD doesn't really act upon those receptors, and yet we still consider it part of the endocannabinoid system, which clearly suggests that the endocannabinoid system is made up of more than just these neurotransmitters and these two receptors. Now I know it would be an entire show to ask you to review all of the parts of the endocannabinoid system, but what I'm looking for is for you to just give us a quick survey of who makes up the endocannabinoid system, like what parts, because in a little bit in the show we're going to be talking about how we're working with the endocannabinoid system, and I want to make sure that people understand the reach.
Sure. Well, the endocannabinoid system is heavily integrated with so many other systems in your body. It can couple or affect upstream, downstream, things like serotonin, which is associated with depression, dopamine, which I think we're all well versed in what dopamine, actions of dopamine are, but also critical roles in inflammation and mood, sleep. So, it's heavily integrated. So I personally like to think of the endocannabinoid system in a classical case, so just CB1 and CB2 and the endogenous ligands, so the cannabinoids that your body makes, and then the transporters, whether that's because you have to get these from point A to point B, and they're all targets for potential making of medicines and maybe plant molecules modulating these systems. Once you go outside of that, then you start calling a lot of different things the endocannabinoid system. So, for instance, TRP receptors, TRP receptors, especially TRPV1, we know is activated by cannabinoids and sometimes desensitized. That's the same receptor for the spicy taste. Right, and that's actually an ion channel. So that's just an example of another system altogether that cannabinoids can function at, but isn't necessarily what I would consider the classical endocannabinoid system. But to your point, there are tons of targets, especially for CBD. We know there are about 68 different targets, meaning places where CBD may work or function in the body, and almost all of those are outside of the endocannabinoid system. And the same can be said for probably at least 100 of the other phytocannabinoids found in cannabis, that their principal role is probably not CB1 or CB2.
So in a way of summary, will you make the case for me real quick? Make the case that for somebody wanting to increase their health span, why working with the endocannabinoid system is a great place for you to be working.
Well, I think, the endocannabinoid system is, as I mentioned, the rest, relax, restore system of the body. Its importance around inflammation and the immune system is critical. And when we think about age-related diseases, a lot of these are mediated by our body's inflammatory response, autoimmune response, and things that have gone awry. So if your body's able to keep these components in check, then maybe you do have better health span and lifespan measures by just keeping everything in this nice balance of where it should be in homeostasis and not outside of that. I think that's certainly has strong potential for extending life and activity. And secondly, I think there's a big role for cannabinoids and endocannabinoids around mitochondrial health. And mitochondria, if you remember back to grade school, are the powerhouse of the cells. So as these things go into decline, you have problems with cellular energetics, which if you don't have energy for your engine of your cell, then kind of everything starts to go awry.
When people talk about cannabis medicine and all the things that it can help, people new to cannabis medicine will also often have this reaction that, oh, you think cannabis is a panacea? It can just cure everything. That's ridiculous. Nothing can cure that much. And what I tell them is it really only helps one thing. It helps balance the endocannabinoid system. And the issue is that all of your body's systems play into the endocannabinoid system. So really, the cannabis plant really has one job, which is to keep the endocannabinoid system in balance. And in my head, I always think of it as, the only thing that you can do other than the endocannabinoid system that can have such far-reaching effects to heal and restore the human body is eating a whole foods diet, because that too reaches every part of your body. How does that set for you?
Well, I think it's an interesting point. First thing I would like to say is cannabis is not cannabis, right? Because we know that there are, I think last time I checked, about 545 potentially active compounds that can be found in cannabis. And we estimate right now there may be up to 150 different phytocannabinoids. And they're all very unique, right? So when we use cannabis as just a plant, it is a very unique plant because of the compounds it produces. These are things like terpenes and terpenoids and flavonoids and obviously cannabinoids, as well as a lot of components that we're not even really well versed in as of yet. The science hasn't really directed us to examine all these components. And with that being said, the complexity is which of these components works where, and how does that affect disease? So to your point, if we're talking THC and some of the other cannabinoids, then endocannabinoid system may be critical. But if you look at something like CBD, I would make an argument for the principal areas of action are not directly related, maybe upstream or downstream, but not directly related to the endocannabinoid system. So again, another level of complexity to a very, very complex situation. I agree with your statement about food. I have a deep interest in nutrition. I would also add exercise and potentially fasting to that as having a systemic beneficial effect to treat multiple diseases.
I've heard you talk before about the aging process as part of this overall topic of living a longer, healthier life, and people often talk about like the body's clock and how you can turn back the clock or stop the clock or different ways that people use that turn of phrase, and I'm curious at a I guess a biomechanical level, what does the body's clock, what is that mechanism? In passing, I've heard people say, "Oh, folate is the body's clock," but I don't actually know what that means.
Oh man, this is. I think there's a lot of components to dive into here. When you talk about body's clock, a lot of this has to do with there are compounds within cells called sirtuins, and they regulate something called epigenetics. And you can think of this: the genetics as kind of the recipe, and the epigenetics. Can either cover portions of the recipe or uncover them for production of critical components for health span and lifespan. So your body basically looks at the recipe and makes what it needs. Over time, those recipes get damaged. And to the degree that cannabinoids play a role interacting with these sirtuins and helping regulate these genes isn't incredibly clear. But I think when people talk about their body's clock, they're thinking about how this information gets damaged over time, and then measuring lengths of things called telomeres, where you can get a kind of a biological age, and they seem to map. Some of these compounds seem to map with biological age, which is very different than chronological age.
So if I were to summarize that, if I was talking to a friend or somebody, I would say that, our when we're young or when we're born, our body is born with a set of recipes to make various, chemicals and parts that make us human. And as we get older, the recipe book starts to get corrupted over time. And so the recipes don't get made right anymore, and therefore the functioning continues to degrade until the souffle flattens and we die. Is that one way to say what you're saying?
Sure, I think that's one way. You start out making chocolate chip cookies, and at the end, they don't look anything like chocolate chip cookies because you've got this disrupted recipe. And I think that's one component, and the other component, has to do with cellular energetics and also the cleaning of the cell. So getting rid of the bad and coming in with the new, and that also gets damaged over time. Your body's ability to heal, which I think everybody can agree that an 80-year-old individual does not have the same ability to heal their injured knee as a 10-year-old, and that ability declines over time for multiple reasons, and some of that is your own body's adaptation to cleansing the bad and bringing in the new.
If as we age, the recipes are getting corrupted, and what we want is thriving cellular energetics, so that we have a longer health span, what is it that is degrading these recipes that potent cellular energetics is able to undo or defend against?
I think it's a great point. A lot of people are investigating this. I mean, there are some people that just have great genetics from the start. These centenarians, that live over 100. A lot of them have smoked cigarettes their whole life and maybe drink too much, etc. But they were just, blessed with, this genetic predisposition of just having this really robust genetic system that takes care of the health of their DNA and their cells. But for most of us, we don't have that. And the things that we can control are largely environmental. So that's what we put in our body, the amount of rest and sleep that we get, the toxins that may be around us, and activity level. And I think that pretty much sums up, the outcomes of how well we can maintain these recipes and the cellular health as we age.
It's kind of ironic that even though, the underlying kind of point of the discussion today is growing and using cannabis medicine as a supplement can increase your health and your health span. At the same time, it's not lost on me that we keep on coming back to the best thing that you can do for your health span is to eat well, sleep well, and exercise. And except for maybe Whole Foods more or less, like those are free things, right? Those are things that don't cost money, and yet they're the hard thing to do. And so people are all like, I still want to stay up too late. I would still like to eat like crap. I don't really want to exercise, but I would really like to buy this bottle of vitamins and just eat these and get away with living my crappy life.
Right. It's much easier.
Yeah.
Right. And we see that, with modern medicine, for instance, some patients that are diabetic may be able to manage it with diet and exercise. And I'm not a physician, so, consult your physician before you do any of that. But it could, in the early stages, potentially be managed with diet and exercise. But it's much easier to take a pill or a shot or take a medication than to put all that effort into controlling something more naturally.
Right on. So, with that said, we certainly recommend a whole foods diet, exercise, and good sleep. But we also want to be able to, do the best we can. And so, we're going to continue the conversation now and talk about, some cannabinoids and what their mechanics look like in the body to support this increasing health span that we want to get. Now, there's 545 compounds and 150 phytocannabinoids, and clearly we're not going to go through them all today. And I don't really think we need to either, because for most listeners, we're really only going to have access to CBD, THC, CBG, and then whole plant resins that will have a smattering of these other phytocannabinoids in it, which we may not even know about because they might not be testing for them in the COA. So we'll just
100%.
So let's just focus on these, because this is what people really have access to, and so we might. And I want to keep this relevant to real people,
Sure.
So since you've already started talking about CBD and the plethora of targets, I think you said 68 or something like way bigger than most people take for granted. And we're going to start with CBD, and then I'm going to hit all of the next three. But let's start with CBD. What is it that we are hoping that CBD does? When people ask me, I just generally say we want the CBD supplement as that we get from the plant to replace an endogenous cannabinoid that we're not making, or that we're depleted in, or we don't have enough of. So our body doesn't have enough, and so we take CBD to replace it, and then it helps keep things in balance. How would you discuss it as a cannabinoid researcher?
I would discuss it a little bit different, because most of my work around CBD has been in treating disease, and primarily, at least the initial work I've done with CBD was in epilepsy, specifically a lot of refractory childhood epilepsies like Dravet and Lennox-Gastaut, where these children had failed, 14 different modern medications and were on 3 or 4 and still having hundreds of seizures a month. And we do see CBD is quite effective, generally reducing about 50% of seizures, with some patients being seizure-free. And it doesn't work like these other anti-epileptic drugs or these anti-seizure drugs. That's, I think, the really clear component is that we know that it is safe and effective for seizures. But these doses are much higher than what you would take CBD as a supplement. So in the clinical trials, patients were taking, between 500 and 1,500, sometimes more milligrams of CBD a day. Now, would that be lower if it was a whole plant extract? I think it would have to be lower, because the whole plant extracts contain THC. Would that be better? It's certainly possible that it would be better, but again, we would really need to do that research. THC is also an anticonvulsant. So as you and your listeners probably know, if you're getting a whole plant extract, the overwhelming majority of them still have some THC present, which may be of benefit to some patients with epilepsy. It could also be proconvulsant to some patients, and it may be of critical importance to areas like pain, and maybe areas like anxiety. Now, as you go down in doses, there's been some evidence that CBD is a pretty powerful anxiolytic. We've seen that for things like public speaking. They haven't done any work with podcasting yet, but maybe that's an option. We do see that the anxiety tends to go down in several studies, and that seems to be at lower doses. If you bring that dose down further to, let's say, 25 milligrams, there really hasn't been a lot of research to say, what do these low doses do? And that's because, it may not be doing much at low doses, or it may be that it takes a long time to see those effects. For example, if you eat a healthy diet or you take certain nutritional supplements, you may not see that immediately. It may be down the road where you see benefit. And those are things that are very difficult to look at and very expensive to look at in a scientific setting.
We often talk about psilocybin on this show, and that's the kind of the whole idea behind microdosing, right? Is that you just take a little bit every day, and so the materials are there, and it's the constancy over time that allows for the neurogenesis and improvement in the brain. One of the things that always gets me about CBD, though, where I'm asking you about the function of CBD. So as somebody who's looking for longevity knows, what the CBD is like doing for them, it doesn't really discriminate, right? It kind of gets into everything. And so it's almost like, all right, I can't tell you specifically what CBD is going to do for you and how soon, but I can tell you that CBD does so much good for so many different systems that you should just take it and just let it decide where it's going to work.
Well, when you have multiple mechanisms, multiple ways of having some sort of benefit, if there's one area that's not problematic, it may not modulate that particular system, which potentially could give benefit if there's another area where that needs modulation or activity. And to your point earlier that I kind of glossed over, CBD is relevant to the endocannabinoid system. There's been a lot of study about it being a negative allosteric modulator, meaning like it can reduce the ability for things like THC to attach to that receptor. There's been some other things like it boosts your endocannabinoids, your body's own cannabinoids. I think those are kind of difficult to really understand if that's really a mechanism. But one of the really interesting studies that I think has just been published was in Fragile X, which is a type of seizure disorder. And these patients have disruptive endocannabinoid system, specifically endocannabinoid tone. And it appears that CBD was able to restore that. And it may be because CBD may prevent the internalization. So basically the disappearance of these CB1 receptors. So think of a tree that gets sucked back down into the dirt, right? So when the tree is gone, then it doesn't matter, what type of molecule you have to stick to that particular receptor. There's nothing there to activate. So it is possible that CBD may prevent some of this internalization, which would be good for the endocannabinoid system as a whole.
So I'm sure that we can describe several different cannabinoids in that similar way, where they can participate in several different ways in several different systems, but we do know that CBG, cannabigerol, actually does different things than CBD does. So next, would you make a delineation and explain to us what is different about CBG than CBD, and how you have found it acting, or what the state of the science is for CBG. Because even though most cannabis enthusiasts are relatively new to CBG, researchers have been jumping on it as the exciting new novel cannabinoid for a few years now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love CBG. I think it's a really interesting molecule to study. It is available, which some of these other minor cannabinoids are not available. And it is quite distinct from both THC and CBD in mechanism. For your listeners, they probably know that CBGA, the acid form, is considered the mother of all cannabinoids. It is after CBG, the cannabis plant produces THCA or CBDA, which we know very well, but it is a principal component in a lot of available cultivars of cannabis now, which makes it easy for us to, or at least easier for us to study. And it's also not a Schedule I compound, so labs don't have to have all these certifications to examine it. So that's step one. It's not been available that long, so we don't know nearly as much about CBG as we do THC and CBD. Primarily, we know that they're different, and then we do know that there's some unique properties for CBG around immune system regulation and around there's something called nucleotide receptors, and those are things that are activated on the nucleus of cells. So it may be very important for coding things that your body produces that are of benefit, or preventing things from being coded that are problematic.
Since the theme for the day is health span and longevity, will you speak a little bit to CBG's activity on the immune system?
Sure. Well, we do see downregulation in a lot of things that are potentially problematic, like tumor necrosis factor and interleukins, which can be kind of broadly destructive and are common in a lot of disease states, autoimmune-related disease states that result in pain and neurodegeneration, etc. So we do know that it has activity there. The interesting thing will be to learn, does that, in combination with other cannabinoids, does that have a additive or super additive effect that can really help treat some of these diseases and conditions?
For folks who haven't come across that vocabulary before, I'd like you to briefly explain additive and more specifically super additive, because we continually make the case for people to consider finding either whole plant or built cannabis medicines that have several of these cannabinoids, and this idea of the sum being more effective than the parts. I think I want people to be able to wrap their heads around that.
Sure. I love this subject. I think a lot of people talk about the entourage effect. It's a very interesting topic, and we do see, I like to think of the entourage effect as super additive, right? And what that would mean, so let's take a step back. So additive, I think of additive as very simply as 1 + 1 = 2, right? So if you're taking, let's say, 2 medications, and one of them reduces your pain by half, or let's say 20%, and the other one by itself would reduce pain by 20%. If you take them together and you get a 40% reduction in pain, then that would be additive. 1 + 1 = 2, which is benefit, right? Because you may not be able to take medication 1 at a higher dose because it may be toxic, or maybe it just doesn't work beyond reducing 20%. Same thing with medication too. So you have this additive effect. But sometimes we see these synergies where we have 2 different medications and they both reduce something by 20%, but you put them together and instead of a 40% reduction, you get a 80% reduction. And that's what I would call super additive effect. And the idea that with cannabinoids, you may be able to combine these, or they may exist already in the plant to where by themselves they would do nothing, or they would help somewhat, but when combined, they do a lot more. And I think that's what the entourage effect is defining. And it could be cannabinoids with other things that aren't cannabinoids as well, like terpenes or flavonoids like canflavins. We're not really sure, but I do think it's important to outline that cannabinoids specifically, sometimes they seem to work well together, and you get this additive or super additive effect, and sometimes they don't. And we've seen that with CBD and THC and glaucoma, where using them together actually prevents the benefits or the decrease in the pressure in the eye of THC, which is relevant for glaucoma. So sometimes it's great to combine these things, but we need to know what we're combining, why we're combining it, and who's it for, and what's the purpose of them taking it. And then we can probably better understand the potential for having these additive or super additive effects.
Great. So I've got one more CBG question before we go to our first commercial break. And that is, we have been aware of CBD, cannabidiol, for a long time. There's now a substantial and growing body of research on it where, except for in extreme circumstances, we're pretty confident that CBD is pretty much good for everybody. We don't really have to be concerned about taking it, and it'll help us or not, but it's unlikely to hurt us. And we were talking about CBG, like we're just learning the benefits, and certainly anecdotally we know about how great it is for things like anxiety and neuropathy and things like that. But because we know so much less about it, do we know yet that CBG is can be generally regarded as safe for everybody, where even though it hasn't been researched fully yet, where we're to the point like, listen, we know CBD is going to be safe. CBG is a lot like it. We know enough about it. Don't worry about taking it. And I'll be clear. I'll say it for you. This is not medical advice to anybody out there who is who's thinking of it that way. But please, Hunter.
Yeah, thanks for that. I don't think we can say it yet. I would like to say it. I will say that in the work I've done, both in C. elegans and rodents, side by side with CBD, I found CBG to be better tolerated at very high doses than I have CBD. So, and again, these are animal models. Tox work usually translates fairly well to humans, but not always. I mean, I don't know if you remember years ago, there was this drug, this company called Bile, and they were making a drug for modulating the endocannabinoid system. It was a Fa inhibitor, and it looked great in rodents, and then they put it in humans, and 3 patients had brain death.
Wow.
Now, I don't expect that is going to happen with CBG, but you don't always know. And we certainly don't know the test, the level. We haven't tested the level to where we can go with CBG. Whereas there's not really an LD50, a lethal dose that kills 50% of the population with THC. No known reported deaths other than I think a guy got smashed by cannabis in his car in a car accident. So I guess that might be related. But and CBD also seems very safe. Acutely, we've given patients 6,000 milligrams. There are concerns with high doses and the impact on liver, especially with other drugs like valproic acid. We haven't done any of that work with CBG, and it's not as well known in humans what doses we could go to. So we're not there yet. It looks promising right now, though. I think it looks like a very promising molecule in terms of both safety and efficacy.
Yeah, I agree. CBG just has such amazing effects, specifically for anxiety in the patients that I've turned it on to it. And it's great, where especially when CBD doesn't work for them, I say, have you tried CBG? And then they're like, oh, wow, that actually worked a lot better for me. And it's interesting, everybody's, different. And that's one of the things I like about cannabis is individualized medicine. because everybody is a bit different. So our next cannabinoid we're going to talk about is THC, but let's do that after the commercial break. So we're going to take a short break and be right back. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is neuroscientist Hunter Land. And, without these advertisers, Shaping Fire would not happen. So please support them and let them know you heard them on Shaping Fire. Online cannabis seed distributors often seem to be all the same. But Multiverse Beans constantly works to provide you with cannabis seeds and a buying experience that you won't find elsewhere. Multiverse Beans works directly with the breeders to secure as many packs of your favorites as possible so that they have your favorite beans long after others have sold out. Some shops simply buy breeder minimums, but I get messages all the time from breeders saying some version of Multiverse asked to buy my entire run. At multiversebeans.com, you can find rare cannabis seeds from Night Owl Seeds, including the Dark Owl sublabel, Mephisto Genetics, Square One Genetics, Robin Hood Seeds, and Ethos, and so many others. Multiverse also initiates projects with breeders to secure exclusive packs that you simply won't find elsewhere. Multiverse founder Paul Lal sees himself not only as a curator of the best cannabis seeds available, but also as a collaborator with breeders, trying to bring novel crosses to the market that his customers are asking for. Multiverse Beans also creates exclusive stickers for their popular seed varieties that are available free only when you order those seeds from Multiverse. Check out their stickers like the badass recent slap for Mothman by Gnome Automatics on Instagram at Multiverse Beans. And finally, the freebies. As you'd expect, Paul sends quality freebies with every order. And when you spend at least $150, Multiverse allows you to choose your freebies from their special selections. You can get a 10% discount off regularly priced items when you use the discount code SHAPINGFIRE, all one word, at checkout. Sign up for their mailing list to be eligible for their monthly seed giveaway worth $250. So go to multiversebeans.com now for a buying experience you won't get anywhere else. Businesses everywhere are striving to reach people through advertising. We all know, though, that trying to reach a cannabis audience with a quality message is pretty difficult. That's why many people choose to advertise on the Shaping Fire podcast. Advertising on this show allows us time to talk about your product, service, or brand in a way that really lets people know what sets your company apart from others. Bold people who own companies know that getting into relationship with their customers is essential, and that is what we offer. We will explain your service or product, what sets it apart as desirable, and help our audience get in contact with you. It's pretty simple, really. Advertising does not have to be all whiz-bang, smoke, and mirrors. Nowadays, I find that people prefer just to be spoken to calmly, accurately, and with good intentions. If you want to make your own commercial spot, well, you can do that too. During these pandemic days, conventions and cannabis events are pretty poorly attended, but podcast listening is skyrocketing. With a commercial on Shaping Fire, you'll reach your customers in the privacy of their headphones right now, and will continue to reach new listeners as they explore the Shaping Fire back catalog of episodes again and again for years. A spot on Shaping Fire costs less than a printed postcard per person, and the Shaping Fire audience is full of smart cannabis enthusiasts, cultivators, and entrepreneurs who are always curious to learn. Do yourself a solid and contact us today for rates on podcast and Instagram advertising. Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out more. One of the challenges with buying autoflower seeds is that often you'll have as many different phenos as you will have seeds in a pack. That can be fun, sure, but so many varieties in one pack is a sign of an immature seed line that hasn't been worked enough. I prefer my autoflowers to be worked enough that each pheno in the pack really captures the aspects that the breeder was intending. This is why I recommend Gnome Automatics to my friends and listeners who grow automatic flowering cannabis seeds. Gnome Automatic seeds are not just crossed and released. They are painstakingly sifted again and again, tested in a wide range of conditions, and taken to a level of maturity that each plant will be recognizable by its traits. Traits that were hard-earned so that you can have your best growth cycle ever. Over the last 10 years, Gnome Automatics founder Dan Jimmy has become a trusted breeder, and he continues to pour his passion of breeding cannabis into every variety he releases for you to grow. Check out the Gnome Automatics Instagram at gnome_automatics to see the impressive plants folks are growing. You can score Gnome Automatic seeds in feminized or regular at your favorite seed provider listed in the vendors section of their website. Commercial cannabis farms across the country love growing Gnome Automatics because of their consistency from seed to seed, short grow times, THC percentages, and colorful bag appeal. Farms interested in bulk seeds of more than 1,000 should reach out through gnomeautomatics.com. While on the website, be sure to check out the Gnome Automatics shirts and other merch section too. If you want reliable seeds, hand-built from effort, expert selection, and experience, choose Gnome Automatics. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I am your host, Shango Los, and my guest today is neuroscientist Hunter Land. So let's pick back up right where we were with THC targets or THC's functionality, because we talked a lot about our familiarity and the substantial body of research we have in CBD, cannabidiol, and then how we have less research in CBG, but we're already seeing all of these fantastic results anecdotally, and we're starting to see them in the lab as well. Well, THC, which is the cannabinoid that most people love first in cannabis when they get turned on to it, it acts in very different ways than the other cannabinoids, most of them that we really like. So why don't you start with that? What are we when we're taking THC with longevity and wellness in mind? What are the functions of THC that we're looking to include in the mix?
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, in terms of longevity, we haven't seen anything that would say that THC is overtly poor for longevity, and we haven't seen any major problems with acute toxicity or neurotoxicity at relevant doses, and there could certainly be some protection. I would say it's just not incredibly clear on how specifically that may help with longevity, other than maybe some neuroprotection and autoimmune type components. That's essentially where we stand right now.
Mm-hmm. So let's hit on that autoimmune component real quickly, because there are autoimmune disease is probably becoming way more common, but it is at least becoming more commonly diagnosed. And so what action does THC take in that realm?
Well, again, there have been some studies, especially around like rheumatoid arthritis and things of that nature, where we've seen clinical benefit. And there have been some studies preclinically that have outlined some benefit around these cytokines, so these compounds that kind of indiscriminately kill cells. But again, it's difficult to make that broad leap to say that THC is certainly going to extend lifespan. I think if you have a condition like, let's say, and we don't know this scientifically, so just to be clear, the FDA hasn't approved THC or THC components for anxiety conditions. But let's say that, as many people do often share, that it helps with anxiety or sleep, then by helping those components, by helping with sleep or pain sensation or anxiety, you may indirectly or downstream effects may be that you have improved quality of life, that you have better activities of daily living, that you feel better as a person, and that all feeds into this kind of health span category, which ultimately could feed into lifespan.
I often suggest to patients who are having inflammatory issues that doing a CBD dominant blend with THC, so you get the anti-inflammation properties of both, is a good combination. And for me, that would be the primary longevity advantage to THC. Are we still seeing that in the research that THC is still, considered a beast when it comes to decreasing inflammation?
In some models, we do see that THC is an effective anti-inflammatory. We also see similar effects with CBD and some really interesting effects with CBDA. And I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here, but CBDA is the acid version that occurs naturally in the plant before we heat it. And I think both THCA, again, the acid version in the plant before it's heated or what we call decarboxylated, seem to be really important for those inflammatory responses.
I think with the conversation that we're having about THC and how the different things that it can do at different levels, this would be a really good time for us to address the biphasic nature of cannabinoids, because I think that it is most obvious to most early users when it comes to THC. So will you review that for us?
Oh, yes. I think I'm so glad you brought it up, because I think this is probably one of the more critical components of being able to especially use THC for its potential to treat disease. So, I think if you look at the literature, and you look at self-reports, a lot of patients will say THC at lower doses help my anxiety. We know it's approved for increasing appetite in multiple indications. We know that it helps with nausea. I think those are clear. But what's also clear is this biphasic effect, where as you go up, then you lose those properties, and in fact you induce the opposite. So low levels, anti-anxiety; high levels, massive paranoia. Low levels, increase appetite, reduce nausea; high levels, vomiting and nausea, the spins, etc. So there is this therapeutic window that I think is incredibly important. And this isn't just unique to cannabis and THC. It's also common in like Robitussin, for example. It can be effective for as an expectorant to help you breathe if you have a cold, maybe with cough and congestion. But if you drink the bottle, you're probably going to hallucinate, right? So there's this therapeutic window, and I think that's where THC sits. The difficult thing around THC is, we mentioned it earlier, is this endocannabinoid tone. So you've got two things in patients that are a little bit confounding when you're doing cannabis research. One of those is, how many CB1 receptors do they have, and where are they? Because that's why certain people can take high doses of cannabis and they're fine, and then other people will take it and they'll have a lot of problems, right? They may be very prone to anxiety, and that's probably based on the dose. And then secondly is, if you're consuming it orally, metabolism. And I'm not speaking like metabolism like how fit are you. I'm talking about these compounds that are in your liver as well as elsewhere, but primarily in your liver. They're called cytochrome P450s, or CYP enzymes for short, and they break down a lot of plant-derived molecules, and what the result is the components, the outcome, so to speak, of how much exposure gets to your brain. Mm-hmm. So certain people just can't break down THC very well, and they get very, very high levels. And other people are rapid metabolizers, and they break it down really quickly. So we have to juggle these two things in research, and there's no way of looking at somebody and saying, oh, you're going to break this down really quickly, so I need to give you a higher dose, or you have more CB1 receptors on your pathways that result in anxiety, so we need to be more careful.
Wow. There's so much in what you just said. Let's see. All right. So going back a little ways, I will say this, and you do not have to comment on it, but it has been a long time since I've thought about robo-tripping. You talked about drinking the whole bottle of Robitussin, and back when I was a young freelance pharmacist, if you will, in college. It was something that we heard you could do, and so you got to get the right kind and all this kind of stuff. And so we tried it, and it's really unpleasant for your gut and everything. But gosh. Yeah, so I haven't thought about that in 25 years, so that's interesting. The second thing is when we're talking about each person is going to have their own, I don't know what you'd call it, but a biphasic threshold for THC. I think that's another good reason why when people start to use cannabis medicine for the first time that includes THC, that you always start low and slow, because you may be particularly sensitive, you may not be, but it's better to start slow and work your way up based on an actual plan of the results you want, instead of just assuming you're going to be fine and starting high and then having to pay the piper, because when THC goes from, jolly good and relaxing to, oh my God, I'm freaking out, and do I need to call paramedics? Which you don't, but you definitely think you might. Like that is a really bad day at the office.
It is bad. It is, THC-induced psychosis is pretty scary. I've witnessed some high-dose THC studies. The FDA, in some cases, wants you to do high-dose studies to figure out where this threshold is, and it can be quite scary. And when we did some of that work with Sativex, patients had to be sedated. So remember earlier when we were talking about GABA, the benzo-like effect being cut off by CB1 receptors. That's one of the reasons that you get this anxiety. So one of the treatments to prevent that is to give benzos, and that's often what can happen in hospital settings when patients get this massive paranoia. So it is scary. For those of you who don't know what Sativex is, it's basically a 50-50 blend of two different plants, high THC and high CBD plant, that was used in clinical trials. And a lot of the research that we have around cannabinoids is based on that particular medicine that's approved, in about 28 countries, but not in the U.S. And when they did those trials, as they continue to learn about it, they had a self-titration built in to the clinical trials. And this is something I worked on in a good bit of depth. And, we would see patients kind of all over the map. Some would have 6 administrations a day, and some would have 12. And you could never look at them and tell. And we asked them to balance the safety and efficacy. So to go up to the point where they felt like it was helping and they weren't getting bad side effects. And I think that's a good rule of thumb if you're using THC. Actually going to the point where you're intoxicated may be negative. There's some evidence that when you get really high, you increase sensation to pain and increase sensation to feeling in general. I mean, if you go back to the 60s when a lot of cannabis was being used at music festivals, I don't know that they were doing it to decrease sensation, and it may be that lower doses are better for treating pain than intoxicating doses.
So I want to take a sidebar because you mentioned a topic that I'm very interested in, and that it's very hard to find information on, and that is rapid metabolizers. So I only learned about rapid metabolizers, about 4 years ago or so, and it explains a lot. And so I want to set it up in a certain way, and then I'd just like you to speak to it because, in cannabis, it is very common for people to have dumb internet arguments about dosage, right? And right. Dr. Russo is talking about optimum doses for THC, well under 20% for nearly everybody, and whereas other times you're I'll watch somebody eat a 200 milligram edible of THC, and I'm like, how in the hell is that even possible? And okay, if somebody is a long-term chronic pain patient, certainly tolerance can be made up over time. But sometimes these people are like newbies, and they're just eating that, and it doesn't seem to faze them. And I didn't really understand that there were these rapid metabolizer people until I met a whole family of them. And it was interesting. I was, aware of their cannabis usage and the doses that they were telling me that they were taking for their various issues. Were like, as far as I was concerned, they were off the charts. Like they were really high. They were, to relax after work. Somebody who was relatively new was taking, 80 milligrams of THC and RSO, and I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. I'd be crying at 80 milligrams, let alone without my tolerance that I've got from years of use, right? And then I was at a music event on the island with one of the people in this family, and I watched them eat 5 grams of mushrooms for their first time, and it didn't affect them, and they're like, oh, I'm a rapid metabolizer, it just my body just like metabolizes everything, like I can't have any fun, and I'm like, man. You're lucky because taking a heroic dose like that without knowing it your first time could also be a really bad day. So it's weird because rapid metabolizers, they explain a lot of these kind of black swan events that as somebody who is trying to support people to learn about cannabis medicine specifically, but, the wider field of entheogens as well, these people, like their biology breaks the rules. So would you just speak to the metabolics of rapid metabolizers?
Sure. It's fairly common that a proportion in these trials will have rapid metabolizers. And there's actually a test that we can do. So it's about $450. And you can be tested to find out which enzymes. So the enzymes are the components that break down these plant compounds as well as other compounds like drugs in the liver. And you can look and you can say, oh, wow, I have a really elevated, or I'm most likely to metabolize drugs that are through the 3A4 pathway, so CYP3A4 or 2C19. There are a bunch of these different enzymes, and they could say pretty definitively say, if you take these drugs, you're going to have to take higher levels or they're not going to work, because as soon as they get to your liver, they're going to be broken down immediately. So that does happen. And you can also have the opposite effect where a lot of patients will break them down very slowly, and they have to go with ultra low doses to avoid toxicity and side effects. The other interesting component here too is that kind of goes on with this is the food effects. So administration in, let's say, a gummy could be very different than administration with fat. We know that with THC, if it's taken with a high fat meal, you increase exposure 3 to 5 fold. So that brings on another level. You've got this endocannabinoid tone. Then you've got, how quickly or slowly are they metabolizing THC or other cannabinoids, and then did they take it with food, because then we've increased the levels that wouldn't normally be there if you took it on an empty stomach. So it gets pretty complicated.
Yeah, it really does. And again, this is another good argument for one size fits all. Just because your friend is taking this other particular blend of cannabinoids and it's working for them doesn't mean that specific blend is going to work for you. And we really need to, start with the basics and build up your endocannabinoid, medicine exposure over time. And also why I, recommend that patients always keep a dosing journal for any entheogens, just so you remember what worked for you and what didn't, and especially what didn't.
Right, and I would say in that journal they should also take note of if it's something that they're consuming rather than smoking. They should probably take note of what they had to eat and what the format was, because if you take it, it could be so minor, as in if you take it with MCT oil, medium chain triglycerides, which is what a lot of these products come in, versus something like sesame or corn oil or hemp seed oil, the exposure is way different. The MCT oil kind of carries it directly to the liver, and some of these other fats can push some of it into the lymphatic system. So it gets into the bloodstream, but without going to the liver first to get broken down. So again, I wish it was simple, but it's not.
That's really interesting. I hadn't heard that about sesame oils being able to push it into the system, bypassing the liver. I'm gonna have to look into that.
Yes, a proportion of it, and this is kind of the same technology. If you hear like SEDS, like self-emulsifying drug delivery systems, or like some of these that are used in beverages or fast-acting. Most of it's not proven, but there are some data available that show that some of this technology can push it quickly into the lymphatic system, and you don't have to wait for it to get broken down by the liver, and there's higher levels in your blood earlier.
Great. So, all right. So let's move on to the next cannabinoid. And since we already did CBD, CBG, and THC, which are most readily available for regular folks, I'm going to create a basket of the rest of the cannabinoids. One that I know that you've done a lot of research in is canflavin, but also there's all these other phytocannabinoids that either we won't have the time to talk about today, or there isn't even any research on them. So I would like you to generally speak to them as this. For people who prefer whole plant resin preparations, like what many people call RSO, Rick Simpson oil, but like a whole resin extract like that. How should we wrap our heads around these trace and novel cannabinoids that will also be in there, right? They're not going to be mentioned on the label. They're probably not going to be tested for, but many of us who are fans of whole plant medicine, we like them in there because of a belief that they hold a synergistic quality, maybe some kind of protectant nature from having a bad experience, and an assumption that they're probably good for us in ways that we don't know. There's a lot of assumptions in what I just said, and so with the goal of trying to speak to how these extra components play a role in longevity for people who are going to be designing their own supplementation system, what do you have to say about these kind of like variables that we can't control, but we're just assuming they're going to be okay?
Yeah, I think it's difficult because it's, to some degree, it's a little bit of a mystery soup, and I would say that mystery soup could be very important. We know that some of the cannabinoids, there's one called THCP, that's in very small amounts in certain plants, but it's a very potent CB1 agonist at low levels. So that may be of critical importance to some of these botanical extracts, but having it there or not having it there could ultimately make a tremendous difference. I would say if you found something that's a botanical extract that you like and that worked for you, then I wouldn't, trying to get something different. You may have a very different effect. This could be down to the terpenes. It could be down to these minor cannabinoids. Canflavins could be of critical importance around inflammatory processes. So without knowing what that is, it's difficult to say, hey, this group of other things, this other mystery soup is going to help or it's going to hurt. And you could, as I mentioned earlier, that those mystery molecules could be the holy grail to treating a disease, or they could be counteracting one another. And we see this with terpenes and cannabinoids. So without having it better characterized, it's really tough. It's really tough to say because they're all so unique. It's a tough one.
So to wrap up this particular topic before we move on, I want to talk briefly about endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome. Our mutual friend, Dr. Ethan Russo, has been on Shaping Fire several times, talking about endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome as it relates to different research that he has done. And it's interesting that one of the reasons we want to supplement our body with these phytocannabinoids that we are sourcing from the cannabis plant is because our own body is not producing the endocannabinoids, the endogenous cannabinoids that are made inside of the body properly. And so, the causes for endocannabinoid deficiency include, poor nutrition, poor sleep, anxiety, and immune suppressing pharmaceuticals, and environmental toxins. A whole bunch of things that are just generally not good for our human, and we get that, right? But I'm of the opinion that the vast majority of Americans are probably suffering from endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome from the beginning. And so, I personally think everybody should be taking some kind of supplementation to strengthen it. Would you speak to, I don't know if you can speak to the commonness of endocannabinoid deficiency, but would you speak to the idea of endocannabinoid deficiency as it relates to, longevity and how, being deficient in endocannabinoids will degrade probably both your length of life and your health span of life?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think it's difficult to say definitively. I think we can both agree, and just about everybody will agree that the endocannabinoid system is critical to health and can play a major component in a variety of different diseases. The interesting thing about endocannabinoids is they're made on demand, and they're metabolized very quickly, especially most of them inside the brain, right? And it would be great if we could just test you like a regular blood test and draw some blood and say, oh, you're an anandamide and you're 2-AG or low.
Oh, that'd
right?
make everything so much easier.
It would make it so easy, but unfortunately, the levels in your blood and how quickly they change based on stress and environment, they don't match what happens in the brain. So if you have endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome, so to speak, that's important because remember, these cannabinoid receptors are also in the periphery. So it's not just anxiety and mood. It could be joint pain. It could be inflammatory bowel disease, something completely unrelated to what's going on in the CNS, then maybe you could examine this and get some idea of a dosing regimen that would help that. But for CNS related disorders, you can't really look at it. So I would agree with you that it's the endocannabinoid system or dysregulation may be a critical component to a lot of diseases. Is it the cause or is it a symptom? I think it's still very difficult to determine, but we do know that it does happen and is associated with many different diseases.
All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is how functional ratios between the different cannabinoids, how that plays a role in your overall health span. Because the underlying idea that I'm suggesting that folks find a blend of cannabinoids that work for them and then take it as a daily supplement to keep their endocannabinoid strong, or their endocannabinoid system strong. How much of each really does play a role? And I've gone in and out of being behind functional ratios. When I was all new to this, I was very into do we want a 20-to-1 ratio, or is it a 2-to-1 ratio of CBD to THC, and this ratio is for Parkinson's and this ratio is, and I realized over time that those might be good places to start, but really every person has got their own functional ratio, I think. And so would you explain how you approach thinking about ratios from a longevity and wellness perspective as a research scientist?
Well, in terms of longevity and wellness, we don't know a lot. I mean, the most recent work is one of the kind of first examinations around C. elegans, looking at isolated compounds versus like this botanical drug substance that contained CBD and CBG and THC together in combination. But, is that the ideal ratio? What happens when you change that? How does that translate to humans? I think it's still in the early stages. In terms of functional ratios and how they potentially could treat disease, I think that's a little bit more clear cut. Especially in when not to use certain things or when to keep certain things low, like THC, and where it may be better to have higher amounts of THC or a smaller ratio with THC and CBD. I think that's a little bit more clear. Again, to do this research with so many different humans who are all different, with so many different diseases and so many different variables is tough, and it's almost like it's a case by case basis. As you mentioned, you said you kind of have like certain ratios that you think are ideal for certain diseases, but that may only be the starting point. They may be able to be further optimized, or on the contrary, there might be certain conditions where you don't need to optimize them very much at all. It may just be that it works at that level, kind of that disease state.
This next thought is for folks who are, so far down the path with this that they're producing their own medicine, because, as we see when the rubber hits the road, when somebody is sick enough and Western medicine has not been the solution for them, and they find their way to cannabis and they find something that works, it's a very short path from, oh my gosh, this works a little bit, to suddenly they're, growing their own plants that are the types of plants that they want, and then they're processing it using ethanol, and they are making their own custom blends that work for their particular body, right? And it's been great, over the last, say, 5 years, with the advent of some of these spectacular hemp varieties that will isolate one cannabinoid, like the all CBD hemp plant that comes from Oregon CBDs, or the all CBG version. So you can grow these plants and make make a CBG oil and make a CBD oil, and then make your type 1 plant, your THC oil. Make 3 different oils and then blend them like a vintner would, like blending a red table wine or something. And that's what I had to do after my brain injury, to find something that was going to be a low enough amount of THC that I could take it during the day and still be functioning at my best level, but then also high levels of CBD I wanted for the neurogenesis and the brain support, and then when it became available, the CBG plants, because they keep my central nervous system from running too hot, which happens to me because of other diagnoses. So this idea of hand blending them, I think is a real winner. So I guess I guess I just would like to hear your thoughts on the gap between what patients need, how patients become citizen scientists, and how so many patients go to the licensed market for their first medicine, and it doesn't work for them like it has worked for other people.
Yeah, I'm on board with the idea of blending to a certain specification from multiple different plants. So, there is a limit to what can be produced in an idyllic ratio from plants. I mean, it's nice to think. A lot of people think, this plant, it's here, it's on Earth, it's for us, it's to cure us, it's to heal us, and that's fine. But plants aren't actually here so we can eat them predominantly because of, a lot of these are defense mechanisms, and they're not bred in such a way that they were so magic that they would just be gone, at least historically. Now, obviously, we grow them and breed them for recreational use or medicinal use, and that's helped. But I don't think that we'll be able to just say, oh, this is the perfect plant in the perfect ratio, and it will stay at that perfect ratio. I think, to your point of saying, hey, let's have multiple different extracts and blend them to a ratio of active components that we know help at this ratio, is probably a much better approach than just saying, some arbitrary named cannabis cultivar is the best for treating this disease. And unfortunately, I think we've seen this in dispensaries in many cases where, grandma goes in and she said, oh, I've got pain. What should I use? And somebody gives her, AK-47 or, whatever. And that's not, they didn't tell her about dosing. They didn't tell her about ratio or anything like that. She has a bad experience. And her thought is, I've tried medicinal cannabis. It didn't work. It doesn't work. And it made me sick, or, somebody says, oh, CBD is good it may help my epilepsy. And they take 25 milligram gummy and it doesn't do anything. And they're like, oh, I've tried CBD for seizures and it didn't work. So I think you're kind of on the right track and more on the scientific track, and the others are kind of more on the branding and optimistic idea that something magical is going to happen.
So I want to finish off this set with a conversation that I know you're really well versed in, and I spend a lot of time thinking about, and because I keep an open mind about it, my opinion has definitely changed over the last decade of working with cannabis medicine, and it is the idea of whole plant medicine versus using isolate. And this is how I'm going to set you up, is that because Dr. Ethan Russo has been my mentor from the very beginning, and he is historically, I dare say, ferociously whole plant, and I learned that from him, and then. And for those who aren't familiar, whole plant means that you're using a method to extract all of the resin from the plant, and then you are taking that resin orally, and then nowadays when there are so many more labs and people are separating the resin from the plant and then continuing to extract the single molecules of, say, CBD or CBG from the resin, and then either selling that as a powder, or taking that powder and putting into a gummy or whatever it is, and then at the extreme, what is going to become much more common is pharmaceutical products, where different components of the resin are isolated and then combined. And I've gone so far when I've been talking at conventions to call this Frankenstein built preparations, and I'm not quite that hot about it as much as I used to be, but we do know that isolate acts different than whole plant medicine. There's a plateau point where more doesn't help anymore, and many believe that it acts differently because it's not necessarily working in a synergistic way with the rest of the novel and minor cannabinoids that are in the resin, and yet there is absolutely good use for it. The first one for me that I had to come around to and embrace isolate was when CBD became popular, but before the CBD plants were everywhere. And so people were like, we want to take CBD in our, cannabis oil, but there's no CBD in the plants that we have near us. And so we decided to start, spiking a type 1 plant, like a THC plant. We started, talking about spiking those preparations with a CBD isolate, because CBD isolate was available before CBD plants were in a lot of places, let alone CBD plants that don't have THC that are going to mess with your ratio, right? And so, I first went to Ethan about it, and he's all like, yeah, until you can get the plant, you can spike with the powder. And, we talked to Dr. Sunil Agarwal, and he's all like, yeah, until you, well, damn, because suddenly I was interested in isolate and recommending it, that patients use it for this particular purpose. Now, with that big setup, I know that, you and I have discussed the challenge between balancing the kind of, ideal nature won't hurt me, nature can heal me kind of like ideal plant medicine headspace that I really grasp onto with the more realistic idea or differently realistic idea that good cannabis medicine is the same every time, gives repeatable results, and hits the goals of the patient. And, I gotta say that there's so many variables in making your own cannabis medicine that very often we won't hit those goals. And so breaking it apart and putting it back together by hand like a pharmaceutical company would, or like you have to do in the lab for your studies, that makes a lot of sense as far as control goes. But then it also makes me cringe because I really do think there is some kind of like unknown X variable of healing that comes with whole plant. So I know this is also probably another topic that you could do a whole show on, but I know there's a lot of people out there who are making their own medicine who really chew on this, and I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Sure. I think it's an interesting topic, and like you said, it could be a long topic. There are a couple components. First, I would say that if you're looking at isolated compounds, quite frankly, you should be careful about what the excipients are in those compounds. And I think this kind of goes without saying for most of your audience. But when you're making an isolate, and this isn't the case with every isolate maker, there's a lot. Are you going
to define what an excipient is? Are you going to get there?
Oh. Yes, I'm going to get there.
All right, cool.
But yes, so an excipient, I'll just go for it now, right? Cool, An excipient is a component that is not what is in that particular ingredient. So an excipient,
like adulterants in the isolate.
Yeah, you could call them adulterants, but they're used specifically for the extraction and crystallization process. So one method of crystallization to make it into a white powder out of a resin is to add things like heptane or pentane. And you can clean those up, right? But depending on who's making it, you could have some of these nasty solvents in there. So it's not the isolate that would necessarily be the problem, but it could be the provider. So I would say if people are using those, it would be important to get a COA that shows things like metals and everything else, but also what solvents are present in that isolate. And that's where, if there aren't regulations in place to make sure the stuff's clean, that taking solvents over and over again, like naphthala or paint thinner or butane, residual butane, could be problematic. So just something to keep in mind when you're using those compounds to fortify existing formulations. The other thing just to point out on the isolates versus the non-isolates is that I think there are certain conditions where to get the entourage or this rational polypharmacy kind of effect may not be needed. And an example would be in some cases of pediatric epilepsy. I don't think the jury's out on how much THC is good or bad for children. And I'm of the group that would say until we know if we can avoid it and get the result we want, that may be beneficial. I think there's a lot more safety data on CBD for kids. So if I can give a child CBD in an isolated form and then be seizure free and not have side effects, then I don't see a good reason to say let's add a bunch of other stuff in there if they're already, basically, if the treatment is successful. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen all the time. It actually is quite infrequent that happens, and that's where you'll need to balance, this whole plant extract. Can these other cannabinoids play a critical role to reducing seizures or help treat disease, and what are those components? So it may be that fortifying existing whole plant extracts with other isolated compounds is the best way to get what you call Frankenstein medicine, but I would say maybe optimized medication. That may be the only way to get there.
It's probably a very similar to the argument you just made, but for those of us who really idealize whole plant medicine, would you make the case to me as a whole plant medicine aficionado on why I should be open to the kinds of formulations that are presently happening at pharmaceutical companies?
Do you mean isolated compounds or whole plant compounds?
We can take Epidiolex or Sativex or any of these where they have taken multiple components of cannabis resin and then they have put together those exclusively. So it's not the entire melange of resin, but they have taken the parts that they think are most essential to getting the desired results for the patient, and but it's not whole plant, but there are reasons for it. So I as somebody who, like, you have a foot in both camps, right? You believe in both, right. And so for me, who is still resistant to pharmaceutical preparations, I would like to hear what you would say to somebody like me, so that all of us who think like me can learn.
So I would say, Sativex is a whole plant medicine. It's literally an extract of two different cultivars of cannabis and blended together, so you have a idyllic ratio, or at least what they thought was an idealistic ratio when they invented it. Now, the other components, the excipients, so what that cannabis is in, isn't necessarily the same as what is commonly available in dispensaries, right? So they use other kind of pharmaceutical components that may or may not be important, so to speak, for delivery. Now, Epidiolex is CBD isolate and sesame oil with strawberry flavoring and a little bit of ethanol to dissolve that strawberry flavoring, and that's primarily done so these kids that are very sick and often they have like autistic like features, or not all of them obviously, but oftentimes that's what happens in these cognitively delayed children. And if it doesn't taste good, then they're not going to take it, right? So I think in these instances, having a pharmaceutical that is prescribed by a physician, that's covered by insurance, that works, is a great step in the right direction. We know that the doses that you need for CBD to control seizures are usually quite high, so from the hundreds to even thousands of milligrams needed to control seizures. If you were a patient, it's almost like dangling a carrot. It's like, hey, we have this treatment. It may help you or it may help your child, but you're going to have to spend $100 a day or $50 a day to buy it off the shelf. Then it becomes unattainable. So having a system, whether it's whole plant, a whole plant extract that goes and meets FDA requirements for being the same thing, standardized, that's proven to work in a disease, accepted by physicians and scientists, and whether you're from the deep South and think cannabis is evil, or whether you're a cannabis connoisseur where you're like, hey, we've got data, it works and it's safe, and it's covered by payers and insurance, is a really good situation for patients until we fix all the other stuff. And that could be for an isolate, or it could be for a whole plant extract that we just know is the same. And because we've proven it works, it gets reimbursed from insurance.
I think that's a really good way to ground that argument, Hunter, that in the end, what is our end goal? Our end goal is not whole plant medicine. Our end goal is to reduce the suffering of our fellow humans. And if we can get there in a way that is safe for their physical body and also relieves their symptoms, whether or not it's whole plant or it's whole plant spiked with isolate or it is a, pharmaceutical blend that was put in a lab, like they're all hopefully getting us to the goal, which is to reduce suffering. And that's the point.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And your audience, most of your audience, I would expect that most of you guys out there listening are not anti-cannabis, but there are people that are completely anti-cannabis, and there are people that are maybe on the fence, but they're just not going to a dispensary. They're not, and a lot of doctors are not going to prescribe grandma or grandpa, purple Kush or, name any one of these different cultivars of cannabis. They're just not going to do it. So we want to help that subset of people, whether they're right or wrong in their opinions, having a cannabis extract, a whole plant medicine, or an isolate that can help reduce their suffering, that would be prescribed by a physician, has a much higher chance of success than trying to convince them to talk to their bud tender or grow their own cannabis and make their own medicine. It's not going to happen for some folks.
Yeah, right on. Well said. All right. Well, this set has gone a little long. This is a great conversation. But let's go ahead and take a break. And then when we come back, we're going to have a nice short set where we're talking about a couple of the things to be careful for when taking cannabis to increase your longevity and health span. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is neuroscientist Hunter Land. You've heard me talk about the award-winning cannabis seeds that come from the analytical breeding program of Seth and Eric Crawford, who founded Oregon CBD Seeds. In fact, Seth was a guest on Shaping Fire in 2020 to talk about triploid genetics. Seth and Eric are now releasing high THC seeds for home growers and farms as Grow the Revolution Seeds at gtrseeds.com. Their high THC seeds are extraordinary in that they will start to flower at 16 and a half hours of daylight instead of the typical 14 and a half hours of daylight. That means in most regions, your plants will start to flower outdoors in the middle of July instead of the middle of August, which means these photoperiod plants finish in September and not October, totally upending the photoperiod seed market. Seth and Eric took their prized early flowering CBG line and bred it to some of the most desired verified genetics out there, including Sour Diesel, Triangle Kush, Wedding Cake, Chemdog, Skittles, and others. These crosses all express powerful photoperiod terpene profiles and THC, giving you a great high. GTR Seeds has a new THCV line with plants like Double Durban and Gigantor that boast 1-to-1 THC to THCV, and people want that THCV. GTR seeds are very consistent, true-growing, inbred F1s from stabilized inbred parent lines. These seeds are nearly homogeneous, and the plants should all grow the same. There is only one phenotype in every pack, available as diploids and triploids. Seth and Eric's company is still family-owned, patient and employee-centric, and partially powered by their 2 acres of solar panels. Everyone can purchase these seeds and the entire catalog of Oregon CBD seeds at gtrseeds.com. Go to gtrseeds.com today and choose something revolutionary for your next indoor or outdoor run. Sometimes the topics I want to share with you are far too brief for an entire Shaping Fire episode. In those instances, I post them to Instagram. I invite you to follow my 2 Instagram profiles and participate online. The Shaping Fire Instagram has follow-up posts to Shaping Fire episodes, growing and processing best practices, product trials, and, of course, gorgeous flower photos. The Shango Los Instagram follows my travels on cannabis garden tours, my successes and failures in my own garden, insights and best practices from personal grows everywhere, and always gorgeous flower photos. On both profiles, the emphasis is on sharing what I've learned in a way that you can replicate it in your own garden, your own hash lab, or for your own cannabinopathic health. So I encourage you to follow at Shaping Fire and at Shango Los and join our online community on Instagram. After you've caught up on the latest Shaping Fire episodes, do you sometimes wish there was more cannabis education available to learn? Well, we got you. Shaping Fire has a fabulous YouTube channel with content not found on the podcast. When I attend conventions to speak or moderate panels, I always record them and bring the content home for you to watch. The Shango Los YouTube channel has world-class speakers including Zoe Sigmund's lecture, Understanding Your Endocannabinoid System, Kevin Jodrey of Wonderland Nursery talking about breeding cannabis for the best terpene profile, Frenchie Canoli's Lost Art of the Hashishin presentation, Nicholas Mahmood on regenerative and polyculture cannabis growing, Dr. Sunil Agrawal on the history of cannabis medicine around the world, Eric Vlosky and Josh Rutherford on solventless extraction, and Jeff Lowenfels on the soil food web. There are several presentations from Dr. Ethan Russo on terpenes and the endocannabinoid system too. While there, be sure to check out the 3 10-part Shaping Fire Sessions series, one with Kevin Jodrey, one with Dr. Ethan Russo, and one with Jeff Lowenfels. And even my own presentations on how to approach finding your dream job in cannabis and why we choose cannabis business even though the risks are so high. As of today, there's over 200 videos that you can check out for free. So go to youtube.com/Shango Los or click on the link in the newsletter. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I am your host, Shango Los, and my guest today is neuroscientist Hunter Land. So here we are with the big finish. You know, Hunter, I wanted to talk about a couple of things that folks should be careful of when designing their supplementation regime to increase their lifelong wellness and health span, because you know, people do put other things in their body as well, and nothing in the body, exists in a vacuum. And so, you know, we recently did a full-length show with Jehan Marcoux about interaction between cannabis and other pharmaceuticals, but I think it deserves to be brought up here as well, since we're talking about, you know, wellness and people, you know, developing a supplemental routine that they use every day, because there is a very, you know, it's very possible, maybe even likely, that there will be interactions between the cannabis regimen that they come up with for themselves and other things that they are taking. And so I would like you to speak to the idea of cannabis, you know, drug interaction, so people can understand the lay of the land as they are thinking this through on how they're going to proceed. Please.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a very important point. I'd like listeners to keep in mind that the reason that we have a lot of these enzymes in our liver, and we have our liver to process compounds that we're exposed to, and many of those are plant compounds. And the way that these enzymes work is when they're exposed to the compound, it breaks it down to something not active or usually inactive that's easily excreted by the body. There's a lot of overlap on what each enzyme breaks down, whether it's a medicine or a drug, a plant, a nutritional matter. The body doesn't know whether it's artificial or if it's real. It sees something that it needs to get out of the body, or at least it thinks. And I'm personalizing the liver now, which is a little bit odd for a scientist. But so it doesn't really, you don't really see this distinction between natural and synthetic as far as the liver's concerned. It just knows it needs to excrete these compounds. The problem comes when you only have X amount of enzyme to break down one drug or one compound, and you also need that enzyme to break down another compound. And that's one example of where you can get elevations. And we see this a lot with CBD, especially at higher doses. So, for example, there's a drug called clopazam that's commonly prescribed in LGS and Dravet, two pediatric, really sad forms of epilepsy. And what happens is if you take CBD in conjunction with clopazam, both the drug clopazam goes up, as well as the active metabolite 7-hydroxy-CBD, which also works. Both of those go up. When clopazam goes up, it causes sedation. And we saw this in clinical trials, and the patients needed to oftentimes reduced either CBD or clopazam after the trial and clinical practice to limit this potential drug-drug interaction. There's also potential interactions around bleeds for things like warfarin, which is a commonly prescribed drug for people with clotting that need to reduce clotting factors. And probably the most concerning thing that we saw in all the CBD research is risk for liver toxicity. So we didn't really see any per se liver toxicity, but we did see indicators in blood work that said, hey, this might not be good for the liver at this dose. And that was commonly in really high doses, and it was also common when they were taking another drug called Depakote, which is a known liver toxin. And these are the ones we know about. There are probably, 5 to 10 other drugs that may have this interaction with CBD where it may not be a good thing. And the same thing can be said for some of these supplements. There's a lot of supplements that combine a lot of different plant components, and some of these can be enzyme inhibitors, so inhibiting the components that break down the drugs, or they can also induce them, basically tell your body, oh, we don't have enough of this, so we're going to increase these levels, and then you're not going to get the quality or the amount of exposure needed to treat your disease. So these can be a tough little balancing act if you're doing it on your own. So it's always good to consult with a pharmacist or a physician about these potential drug-drug interactions.
And for considering the state of the technology and everything right now, for the common person, probably the place to start would be to Google your pharmaceutical that you're taking and the word cannabis and start there, right? Because that's pretty much going to be your entry to any of this kind of data, and then follow up with whatever studies you come across, if there are any.
Sure. Yeah, that would be one way. You could definitely do that. Again, cannabis, if you look up, if you've got just a little bit of CBD in your cannabis, that's probably not going to be the same as if you're taking, like you mentioned, a high CBD chemovore of hemp, right? So dose is definitely a critical component to these. I think it's a reasonable place to start. The other thing would be, pharmacists actually are pretty knowledgeable in this area, and the other type of drug-drug interaction that we see is pharmacodynamic interactions. And what that means is, like, how does it might not be the molecules themselves interacting, but it may be that kind of like you're having the entourage effect to treat disease. You might have an entourage effect for inebriation or sleep or something like that. Whereas, like, if you drink alcohol with cannabis, they're not necessarily interacting directly, but they may have a pharmacodynamic interaction. Like, then if you didn't want to drive the car with your, X amount of drinks, you might definitely not want to drive the car with that plus cannabis. So those are things. And that happens with other medications too, like commonly prescribed antidepressants or a lot of these drugs that are mood stabilizers and things that are for sleep. So you might get these other interactions, especially with THC, the pharmacodynamic ones.
I've got one more safety question, and then we'll wrap up. We've been talking about a lot of different dosages, and some of them are quite high. For people who are developing their own regimen, is there a too high a dose that can actually hurt? Like, as many of people have said, it's like, oh, even water can kill you if you take enough of it. So we do know that there's like a maximum for pretty much everything. But how can somebody who's formulating for the first time think about the how much is too much question?
Yeah, well, I think, we've seen, cannabis generally is pretty safe, but you also see cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. Some individuals just
end up, for whatever reason, over time not being able to tolerate THC very well. So there is that component that it could change. What is safe at the beginning may not be safe months or years later. And secondly, I think it would be a reasonable idea if you're taking CBD, in hundreds of milligrams types doses, looking at your kind of standard liver panel, your standard liver enzymes as part of your physical exam, I think could be important, because you can always see these elevations, or maybe you already have these elevations, and then piling CBD on top of that may be a risk. So I think it would be in everyone's best interest to kind of monitor these things just for peace of mind.
Right on. And if folks are new to this idea of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, we did an episode 80 on it with Dr. Ethan Russo, whose name has come up a lot today. He's
a great guy.
Yeah, he is, and he's researched so much, so you can't really talk about cannabinopathic medicine without tripping over a bunch of his research, right? So episode
Exactly.
80 if you're new to that. So all right, so Hunter, to bring us to the close here, we have talked about cannabinopathic medicine today in terms of longevity and not only the length of life, but also the quality of life. And instead of often we think about cannabinoid medicine as, oh, this is broke, how do I fix the broke thing in me, right? Whereas when we're talking about lifelong wellness, it's more about keeping the system going and rebalancing itself and rejuvenating itself, keeping those systems functioning. To bring us home, what do you see as the novel cannabinoids or the research that you are seeing evolve right now that hold a lot of promise for longevity with cannabis medicine?
Oh, well, I think it's a really interesting topic. I have an acute interest in both botanical drug substances that combine or include multiple different cannabinoids to whether we want to say entourage or additive, super additive effects, or rational polypharmacy. There's a bunch of ways to term it, but go to treat disease in combination by multiple different methods or mechanisms. So I have a really big interest in that, and I think that relates directly with age-related disease. So maybe in preventative medicine, and maybe once you've passed preventative medicine, maybe we can stabilize those conditions. And the other thing is these, what I would consider more novel cannabinoids, things that are understudied, like the acids, the cannabinoid acids, so before they're heated, and some of these other cannabinoids like CBC and CBE, and a lot of these really understudied cannabinoids that we just don't really know. We know they're active, we just don't know where to use them and how to use them and how much we should use. So I think I've got a lot more work ahead of me, as well as many other cannabinoids, so to speak, in the space.
Right on. Well, Hunter, thank you so much for spending your time with us and bringing your unique experience that has, your ability to do complex research in the lab, but then the other ability to be able to speak about it to lay folks like us, so that we can better understand, the cannabis medicine that, so many of us rely on. So thank you so much for sharing your very valuable time.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me.
If you want to learn more about Hunter Land and keep up with his research, there's two great places to do that. The first place to do that is his LinkedIn profile at Hunter Land, and also where he does his primary research, which is at Biopharmaceutical Research Company, and their website is biopharmaresearchco.com. You can find more episodes of the Shaping Fire podcast and subscribe to the show at shapingfire.com and wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed the show, we'd really appreciate it if you would leave a positive review of the podcast wherever you download. Your review will help others find the show so they can enjoy it too. On the Shaping Fire website, you can also subscribe to the newsletter for insights into the latest cannabis news, exclusive videos, and giveaways. On the Shaping Fire website, you'll also find transcripts of today's podcast as well. Be sure to follow on Instagram for all original content not found on the podcast. That's at Shaping Fire and at Shango Los on Instagram. Be sure to check out the Shaping Fire YouTube channel for exclusive interviews, farm tours, and cannabis lectures. Does your company want to reach our national audience of cannabis enthusiasts? Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out how. Thanks for listening to Shaping Fire. I've been your host, Shango Los.